My name is Walt Meisner, and I'm the Dean ad interim of the College of Fine Arts. And I am delighted this evening to welcome you to the 4th annual Tim Hamill Guest Artist Lecture. Tonight we have the great pleasure of welcoming two guest artists, Chuck Close, painter and photographer, and Robert Storr, curator and critic. And we are pleased to have both of you with us. This lecture series was created in honor of Tim Hamill. Tim earned both his BFA and his MFA in painting back in the late 1960s, and in the years that have since eclipsed, Tim Hamill has built an impressive career in his early days as an educator and a prolific painter, today as a director and owner of the Hamill Gallery of African Art. The College of Fine Arts and the School of Visual Arts are privileged to count Tim, along with his dynamic wife and partner Bobby, as true advocates and friends of this college. Tim had a passionate desire to enrich his alma mater and enlighten its students. He pressed forward with a vision to create a lecture series that would offer new perspectives to the current students of the School of Visual Arts and help them find their own unique artistic vision. This is an act of generosity as it gives back to the students of the artistic community where Tim first found his means of expression as an artist. I cannot think of two artists better suited to this mission than our guests tonight. I would now like to invite the director of the School of Visual Arts, Lynn Allen, to introduce tonight's special guest. Please welcome Lynn Allen.
Thank you, and welcome, everybody. It's a great crowd. We're happy to see that. Before I start, I would like to ask any of you with cell phones to please put them on stun so we're not interrupted. And I also wanted to inform you that there will be look how many people all of a sudden pull out their cell phones. It's incredible. There will be a question and answer series when Rob and Chuck have finished conversing, which they will start themselves. They'll just ask, are there any questions? There will be people in both aisles with mics. So if you have any questions, just raise your hand and a person with a mic will come and give you the mic and take the mic away for the next time. So our guests need little introduction. If one wants to find something about Chuck Close, there are 1,921,000 entries to choose from on Google. Rob Storr's accomplishments are equally brilliant and span the art world as a curator, academic, critic, and painter. Rob received his MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and has gone on to teach painting at such prestigious schools as the Rhode Island School of Design, Tyler Art School, and Harvard, among others. He has been the curator of scores of exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, including Elizabeth Murray and Gerhard Richter, and the author of dozens of monographs and catalogs. As a painter, he has exhibited in shows in New York at the Betty Cunningham Gallery, the Jack Tilton Gallery, and the New York Studio School. Sorry, there's no podium, so. Presently, he's the dean of the Yale School of Art and was the curator and the first American curator of this year's Venice Biennale. He and Chuck Close have been friends for a long time and have spoken often in forums such as this. Rob has said that Chuck is a pretty active guy, as artists go, and an amiable guy, but a strong-willed guy. Chuck says about himself that he was not good at a lot of things, so he set his sights on the one thing he could do well. To hear him humbly speak about his career, he will tell you about all the odd jobs he has done to sustain his passion and the importance of sticking with that passion. He has led a marvelous career as a painter, but also as a printmaker, where for over 30 years he has pushed the boundaries of traditional printmaking in remarkable ways. I had to stick that printmaking thing in. Chuck's interest in paint and faces is now legendary. He has said that a person's face is almost a roadmap of their lives. Some of us are not so thrilled about that. But what we are thrilled about is to be able to sit with you both this evening. Please join me in welcoming Rob Storr and Chuck Close.
I'm going to kick this off a little bit, and first of all, just say that if I've yawned a couple of times so far and yawn a couple of times more, this has nothing to do with what Lynn said, nothing to do with what Chuck said, nothing to do with you. I hope nothing to do with me, what I say, but it's simply a consequence of having been on airplanes coming from the Persian Gulf yesterday, and I'm like wiped out, but I'm here.
and a stiff scotch.
And a stiff scotch, yeah. This is in, what? You can't hear it? Can you turn my mic up? Because I can't bellow any louder. Whoop. Okay. As Lynn said, Chuck and I have known each other for a long time. About the end of the 90s, I guess it was, I was co-author with Lisa Lyons of a monograph on Chuck's work, and then in 1998, we together made a retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art. And we've done many other things, and I've written on other occasions for him. And often, we have gone out in the world on those occasions to do conversations, which are an extension of conversations that we have in the studios, usually oiled by good scotch, this time primed by good scotch. So in a sense, you're coming in the middle of an ongoing conversation, one that has even started earlier today with students from the painting department.
You should have heard us before.
But the reason these conversations go on is that there's much to be said. Our realities, each of our realities has changed a good deal over the years, and of course the art world and the context of painting and other things has changed as well. So what I wanted to do, given that we haven't done this actually in about 10 years almost, was to jump in and ask some things about recent events as a way to get started. And I just note that this past week, in fact the day before yesterday, a dance piece called Sea to Sea, curated by a choreographer from Boston, Jorma Ello, and then to the music of Philip Glass, which is in fact Philip's portrait of Chuck, Chuck having done Philip's portrait many years ago, and it'll probably come up shortly, was done, and it was commissioned by Bruce Livingston, who's a pianist that we both know, and who performed on stage in this dance. That's one thing, but only one, and it's representative of Chuck's world that there are seldom one things or even two things going on. Simultaneously, he's having a major exhibition in London at the White Cube Gallery, which is one of the most important galleries in London, and he's also had a new monograph by Christopher Finch come out from Prestel. So within the space of a month or 2 months, he's in the world in a new book, he's in the world in a dance performance for which he also provided backdrops, but that is in a sense based on him and on his dialogue with another artist in another medium. And again, he has this retrospective. So since I don't know the answers to this question, I will ask on your behalf and mine a little bit about the recent events and how each one of them connects to the ongoing activity, studio and otherwise.
Well, basically, the answer is I can never say no, and that's I get myself into a lot of projects. It was incredibly flattering to have Phil Glass, who I've known since I met him in Paris in 1964 or 5 with Richard Serra, and then later we worked together to help Richard build his early lead prop pieces. He was, amongst other things, a taxi driver and a plumber, and he plumbed my first 2 lofts. I'll have to say he's a better composer than he was a plumber. But I took one photograph of him in '68, and I did probably 100 or more various pieces of him over the years. And he returned the compliment or whatever, and did this musical portrait of me. And then American Ballet Theater thought that it would be interesting to do a ballet based on it, and was commissioned to do that, the choreography, which is really quite wonderful, and I sort of did sets, I guess. And it's a exercise in complete narcissism. I had my eyes spread across the stage for about 100 feet. First, early work in black and white, and then second, a late work in color that were interpreted as backdrops. And it's a wonderful choreography, but the thing that I thought was interesting was When I came up in the 60s in New York, it was a time of incredible cross-fertilization across media. And before Philip Glass ever performed in a theater, he was in lofts. We, along with dancers like Trish Brown and Yvonne Rainer and many others, these things were going on in what would later become Soho almost nightly. Actually, Philip's first public performances were in art museums. The Whitney, the Guggenheim, and the Walker were his first public performances because the music establishment wasn't interested in what he was doing. So a lot of them still don't like what he's doing. And it was part of that incredible mix of ideas for people who are trying to figure out why make art now, and the fact that all those barriers between mediums was breaking down.
Let me ask you a little bit about the way in which you're often described. The shorthand is you are a photorealist. And in what sense is that really true? In what sense are you a realist? In what sense is the photography a baseline or a means or a catalyst or any of the possible things that it can be in art, given that Degas and Delacroix and many people started using photography back in the 19th century?
First of all, the reason I used to, maybe still do, chafe under the word realist, new realist, photorealist, is that I think I've always been as interested in artificiality as I am in reality. And in fact, it is I hope they're paintings first, and I think it's the tension between the distribution of marks on a flat surface and the image that's being constructed from those marks. And I like for the viewer to sort of rip back and forth between the two. A few years ago, I was living in Rome, and I had never seen the Byzantine mosaics in Ravenna. So I made a pilgrimage up there, and I was really disappointed when I saw them. I was so upset because they were way up high in the dark, and you couldn't see the individual tesserae, and they were glittery and, you know, sort of theatrical. And I was so disappointed. I went back to Rome, and I revisited the humble Roman floor mosaics. And the viewing distance for them is, of course, your height. And you're aware of the flatness of the floor because you're standing on it. And it's made of lots of little stones. So it keeps saying flat, stone, 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 flat, artificial. Then it sort of warps into a lion's head. You say, oh, look at that. And just when you're trying to see the lion's head, it flattens back out again and becomes stones. And I realized that across the centuries, I was having really a contemporary experience with the artisan who made that, because it was a record of the decisions that he made. And I'm sure it was a he. I don't think they let women do that sort of thing. And I thought, wow, this is so close to what I do because of that ripping back and forth between the two. And a long answer to your question, I'm afraid, but obviously photography is an important factor in what I do. And in fact, I'm making daguerreotypes, which are the first form of capturing an image from 1840. I'm not interested in it as an antiquarian activity, but because everything I love about photography was there from the very beginning. But in a way, photography came to the rescue for me. I have a kind of, everything in my work is sort of driven by my learning disabilities. I was very learning disabled. And one of the characteristics of my learning disability is a kind of face blindness. which I'm sure drove me to make portraits in the first place and commit them to memory by scanning them. But flattening them out is what's important. And then I have a chance of being able to remember them. And being able to go back and refer to them again to make sure I really saw what I saw, very important also. So I'm sure that for me, they are a kind of, well, that's enough of that.
Well, you mentioned daguerreotypes, and the daguerreotype work started around, I don't know, 96, 97, something like that. So it's relatively recent and it's been ongoing. The daguerreotypes are unique. There's no negative.
Right.
You have one print per image, or one image per image. When you started making prints in the 1970s, you also went back to one of the oldest processes for printmaking, and also one that had been left behind, which was mezzotint. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about not just your choices of these abandoned techniques, but of the relation of that decision to the idea that what artists are always doing is trying to outstrip technology, beat the image industry at its own game, et cetera, et cetera. It's like you're almost consciously doubling back in the age of mechanical reproduction and making it as hard as possible.
Well, I think I'm really interested in on-the-job training. And one of the best ways to do that is to do something that other people have devalued and considered to be useless and hopelessly lost. And when I first started making paintings in the 60s, painting was dead. I've been around long enough to have painting be dead 5 or 6 times. But if you were dumb enough to be a painter, you sure as hell didn't want to be a figurative painter, because that was even stupider yet. And the most moribund of all possibilities was portrait painting. And I remember Clement Greenberg saying there was only one thing that you can't do anymore, and that's paint a portrait. And I thought, oh. That means I won't have all that much competition, and I'll have lots of elbow room, and I won't be so influenced by what everybody else is doing. I won't be part of some larger attitude or activity or movement or whatever. So I've always been drawn to things like that. Mezzotint, I thought it would be nice if the print shop had to learn how to do it at the same time I had to learn how to do it. And similarly, I think but it's not that they're antique. It's that there's still a lot of life in them, and you can go and inhabit something. It's like finding a great old house or a great old synagogue or something and finding a new use for it. And it's been a kind of modus operandi for me for a long time, I think.
Well, could you talk a little bit in that respect about the sort of conventional wisdom in art history and so on is, and beyond art history, in the popular press, is that technology can produce these absolutely dead ringer images effortlessly, digitally, whatever it is, and why bother do it by hand? What is it that enters into the handmade process that is not the cult of the handmade object, but that's actually visible, materially different information that means that those kind of predictions of the obsolescence of the handmade image don't count for you and maybe not for lots of people?
Well, the main reason, I think, is that while you're there making the stuff, it keeps you off the streets and out of trouble. But I like stuff, and I like to make stuff, and I want to be there for a long time and see what happens. It's really been hand building something. I mean, obviously before I was making portraits, Andy Warhol was making portraits. And actually they weren't even seen as portraits at the time. They were sort of almost like logos for popular culture. But Andy, other than the early hand-painted pop things, he made his image in one squeegee stroke. And I loved him. I have 2 Marilyns, and I'm a very big fan. He kicked open a door for all kinds of, truly modernist figuration, as did Alex Katz and Philip Pearlstein and some other people. But, I wasn't interested in making an image in one gesture. I wanted to carefully handcraft and build this thing because the activity itself is what interests me. Almost every idea I ever got, I got out of working. And it's a very good way to keep from getting stuck. If you are doing something and you have lots of time to think while you're doing it, the next piece just sort of logically follows after what you've been doing. And it's a way to protect yourself from the buffeting winds of change as styles come and styles go and tendencies go to this direction and that. If you are following your own trajectory and going where those things seem to lead, you have an opportunity to develop something which is far more personal and idiosyncratic and far less the conventional wisdom. At any given time, what art looks like is pretty obvious, what the issues are, and it's very hard to think outside of that narrow definition of what art should be at that moment. And I think you have to almost trick yourself into being an individual and fight that kind of group thrust in a particular direction.
A long time ago, there was a symposium on quality in art, and quality, of course, is a term which has been used a lot, often to beat up modern art. Old art had quality, new art doesn't have quality, and by that it's often meant that old art has finesse, has conventions we understand, beautifully executed. I think it was Solo who said once, a bad idea is not saved by beautiful execution, although many people who insist on quality in the narrow sense believe that actually that can happen. But in any case, and Harold Rosenberg in the same symposium countered, and he said basically quality in modern art is not the same thing perhaps as quality as it's been defined historically. Quality in modern art is freshness. Mm-hmm. And your work, like that of Jasper Johns, like that of Saul, and a number of people, poses the question in a way of how do you keep art fresh in circumstances where you may wish, in fact, to use a similar set of premises or variables. And in your case, you've been painting heads since 1967. What's the mechanism, what's the drive, what's the way to constantly find new information in an image you know?
Well, part of it comes from actually working from photographs. If I had a sitter come into the room, first of all, I'd get really annoyed with having them be there for 6 months, 8 months. They wouldn't want to be there. They would gain weight, they'd lose weight, their hair would grow, they'd cut it off, they'd be happy, sad, awake, asleep. So the use of the photograph becomes something that I can refer to again and again. And each time I can see whether or not I saw what I thought I saw. But it's also something that can be recycled. And that's really one of the things that I think has pushed my personal development implies progress. I just want movement. I just want to be able to move from where I am to somewhere else. And often that takes the form of taking a photograph that I've used many times before. And I've said it's almost like a magic well that you can throw the bucket in, and each time you pull the bucket out, you get something different. Every time I go back to that photograph and I have a new procedure, a new process, new material, new scale, new attitude, new pictorial syntax or vocabulary, I get something else out of the photograph. And being able to refer back to what I've done before makes it clearer what I'm doing now. Now, I just rephotographed Phil recently, and that's part of a basis of new tapestries that I'm doing. And there's another centuries-old process. This is really, to me, it's fascinating. I'm working in a mill in Brussels that's been making tapestries for 600 years. The unicorn tapestries were made in this place. And they're still in business. And I had an opportunity to make tapestries with them, and I took this old material of daguerreotype and stored in this image on a mirrored, polished silver surface is a wealth of information. It's like a contact. It's like a. It's not an enlargement. It is what it is. Well, you can't photograph a daguerreotype because you see the camera in the surface. But we discovered that if you lay it face down on a flatbed scanner, the scanner illuminates the daguerreotype and stores the information at the same time. Now I have this information and I'm thinking about making a tapestry. Tapestries, like everything I do, is made up of lots of little pieces, little woven threads. We have 60,000 choices of thread colors, of which I used about 6,000 for the color ones, and 400 or 500 for the black and white ones. And the wild thing about this is, I discovered in the process that the modern day computer came out of the tapestry technology. That they were trying to automate the tapestry business, and individuals would have to make a decision which threads go up and which ones go down. So simultaneously in Belgium and also in China, the idea of taking paper, punching holes in it, and pulling that through the loom would send a thread up or send another thread down. This became the basis of the IBM punch card. The first computers had those paper cards with holes punched in them. And that became the basis for the modern day computer, which is essentially a 1 or a 0, which represents the hole or no hole. So here I am using the most cutting edge modern day technology to go back to use a medium that influenced that technology itself. Everything just keeps going full circle. Every time you think, every time you approach something and think about it, and in fact, if you look at my beard in one of these tapestries, it looks exactly like the foliage in the back of the unicorns. And the reason it does is the logic that built the foliage in the unicorn tapestries is the same logic. How do you build something out of a bunch of threads? How do those threads stack up to look like something? Obviously, there's nothing about thread that looks like a unicorn or my beard. It's only how those pieces are put together. And this has been the basis of everything I do. When I took that first photograph of Phil Glass, not only was it a compelling image, wonderful face, heavy kind of druggy eyelids and big full lips. I always like the orifices in art, like the great orifices in art are The Woman of the Pearl earring by Vermeer, some others, but he has great lips. But also he had Medusa-like dendritic curls, which are perfect for being translated into little dots or fingerprints or little pads of pulp paper or diagonal lines or whatever. And formally, it becomes a basis for invention as well. Not only is it interesting as imagery, but translating it, pushing it through another vocabulary, another system, another mark-making method, makes me a different artist today than I was the last time I picked up the photograph.
Actually, Phil must be sort of sore at you. He's been forever young up until now. Time's catching up with him, but anyway. The first paintings, and this is actually a very good, that's Phil on the far side. This is Richard Serra, looking like the tough guy that he actually is, but tougher even. When you made these first paintings in 67, 68, 69, thereabouts, you were doing continuous tone, grayscale with an airbrush. Then you did 3-color continuous tone paintings.
I think are coming up.
Which are coming up. And you've gone through a series of phases. Certainly in these first ones, there was a deliberate suppression of gesture, of mark, of anything that could be associated with handwork according to the conventions of the day, when actually we were still, in the shadow of abstract expressionism where the wrist and the arm were all. I wonder if you could talk about your decision not to do what was thought to be, in fact, the essence of painting at that time.
Yeah, I grew up in a period of, I was a junior abstract expressionist, 3rd grade or something, and all the angst had been removed.
Grade, 2nd grade.
Okay, whatever. all the angst had been removed, and we were just, we hadn't been around long enough to have any angst yet. So the whole thing of the rectangle as an arena into which you poured your guts and you fought it out, you slugged it out with a paint. We came along and we imitated the surface of the thing. And as art students, we got pretty good at imitating the surface of the thing. It was said that once you know what art looks like, it's not hard to make some of it. The trouble is, it's going to look like someone else's art, or it wouldn't look like art. So then you have to find a way to empty that out, get them out of there, and find what you want to do. And sometimes you don't know what you want to do, but you sure as hell know what you don't want to do. So I sort of used that as a way to move forward. I constructed a series of limitations that wouldn't allow me to continue to make those paintings. And that was we were talking to the students earlier, that was very much in the air in the late 60s. A whole trying to find a way to purge your work of any reference to any other artist and to rid yourself of the art world baggage that we had all carefully taken into our studios. And a lot of that was by the choice not to do something. The painter Ad Reinhardt was a great influence on me because he made these lists of things you weren't supposed to do. And he made the choice not to do something a positive decision, because when you stop doing something, it forces you to do something else. And artists like, you were talking about Saul LeWitt and his choices, limitations, whatever, or Richard Serra's lists, to lean, to fold, to stack, to whatever. A way to think about making sculpture that had to do with the properties of the material that he schlepped into his studio. Schlepp is a good word for a former synagogue, but he didn't want to work in wax or stone or marble or bronze. All of these things were considered to be shop worn and used up, so he would bring materials in that hadn't been used in art, and then see what you could do with it. And that was very, very much in the air, and that was sort of how we progressed. We tried to back ourselves into our own corner where no one else's answers would fit. I think as a society, we're much too interested in problem solving. Problem solving presupposes that everybody's answering the same question, the question of the moment, and it's very hard to come up with an answer that's yours. The only answers that occur to you are the prevailing wisdom, the logic of the time, which is, oh, this is the answer to that question. Far more interesting than problem solving, I think, is problem creation. If you can ask yourself an interesting enough question, no one else's answers will fit, and you will have to come up with something that is personal and unique. All of this, of course, is antithetical to the current practice of appropriation, which has produced a lot of very interesting work. But what you do then is sort of raid the cultural icebox and try and find the closest appropriate previous answer to that question and make it your own, and then put another spin on it and try and put your own stamp on it. But my generation was hell-bent to purge our work of every reference to every other artist. You didn't want anybody standing in front of your art and thinking about someone else.
Along about, and I'd have to think about exactly the dates, but anyway, before you were paralyzed, about 4 or 5 years before you were paralyzed, you actually made a very dramatic change from suppressing the hand to actually letting the hand show, from mixing color by filtering one color through another, glazing, basically overlaying in the manner of the print process, to actually pre-mixing and applying color. And you sort of gave yourself permission to do all those things that you had actually withheld permission for. And I wonder if you can talk not only about what brought that moment about, but also what it felt like to revisit, if you will, a series of things that had been tempting, but that you had turned into taboos.
Right. But before, a nod of the hat to Rob as the curator of my retrospective at the Modern, because it really speaks to what I did just before I went in the hospital and what I did after I did in the hospital. Rob is a really, obviously a great art writer, perceptive, and has been extremely important in defining the issues for individual artists as well as the issues of the moment at the art world. Largely because I think he's also a painter, and he has the shared experience with the people he's writing about and the people he's curating. He knows what it's like to push the stuff around. He knows what accomplishes a cheap effect and what took a little bit of work. But Rob did something which is one of the greatest gifts that he or anybody else could give to me. People were very invested in the idea that my work before I went in the hospital was dramatically different from the work that I did after I got out of the hospital. In fact, the ballet is a dramatization of that. Black center sequence in which I am struggling to use my hands again, and what early minimal work and late expressionistic work, and I'm making expressionistic work because I can't do the early work anymore, or something like that. And what Rob did for me, which was brilliant and an incredibly kind gesture to me personally, he took the last show I did before I went in the hospital and the first show I did after I got out of the hospital, and he mixed them together in one large gallery. And what he did was challenge the viewer to tell which ones were done when. And that just sort of settled that issue for many people for once and for all, because an artist's career is a continuum. And things happen, interrupt it, but it didn't mean that I was one person before and another person after. And I'm greatly indebted to you for making that very clear. Now,
That's Leslie.
yeah. When I was working in black and white, I didn't use a palette. I sprayed the painting directly on the paintings. There was no palette. Everything happened in the rectangle, in context. When I went to the full color, 3-color paintings, which are back there a ways, you may have seen that I'm working from dye transfer color separations, a red one, a blue one, a purple one, a yellow one, or whatever. And those paintings were made by spraying paint directly on the canvas. Again, everything mixing. I made a red painting, I put a blue painting on top of that, and a yellow painting on top of that. So I was making paintings in which everything happened in the rectangle, in context, adjacent to pieces that were already completed and in anticipation of pieces that I'll do later. But at any rate, I wanted to make all the decisions right there. And when I decided to go back to oil painting, I wanted to find a way to work in which the decisions continued to be made in the rectangle. So what I did was I found a way to make something wrong. I would find, let's see, are we getting to?
It's coming up, yeah.
Maybe.
Going away.
Oh, we're going the wrong way. We're going,
No, it's a little, there we go.
there's an unfinished painting of John Chamberlain.
That's Lucas Morris.
Yeah. Well, at any rate, what I did was put color down that was not color that was anything like skin, blue, yellow, green, purple, whatever. There's a Seurat show in New York right now, and everybody thinks Seurat optically mixed his paintings. In fact, if you look at his paintings, in any given area, the generic color is the generic color of the thing he's painting. Almost all the dots in the grass are green, with some yellow and blue, whatever, thrown in. Almost all okay, stop right there if you can. Almost all the color in the sky is blue with some other colors thrown in. I wanted to try and build it out of very unlikely colors. So you see from the vision on down, those are colors that are simply put in to be relatively capriciously and arbitrarily to be wrong, so that then in a series of 4 or 5 or 6 correcting strokes, I can move it from something wrong to something that's right. And that's
an optical mix, basically.
An optical mix. And the interesting thing about that is sneaking up on it and finding it instead of conceptualizing what you want and just doing it. When you work with a palette, you're mixing a color out of context and hope that when you drop it into the painting that you've made the right decision. I want to find it. I want to find it in the painting rather than predetermine it and execute it. So,
I mean, that looks like the aquas and colors that you'll find in the Miami Beach hotels and houses and whatever it is. So how do you get from there to the optical mix?
well, you know, I had to purge de Kooning to make my paintings in the first place. And I was just looking for a way to get the Kooning color back into my paintings and still have it look like me. I don't particularly like the biomorphic shapes in a lot of people's paintings, especially American painting pre-1945, and I'm using them every day. Some things that are sort of debased and out of it, again, can be given a new use, can be charged in a way that makes it more unexpected and sort of surprising that it's useful again and useful to do in service of something else. I'll stop right here for a second. Sometimes I use a horizontal vertical grid and sometimes I use a diagonal grid, and that comes from, I take a photograph, I have grids drawn on pieces of mylar or acetate. I slide them around on top of the photograph, and I see how the rhythmic beat of the grid falls. And I imagine what it might be like to make a painting with that. And then I draw the grid on the photograph, and the only drawing on the painting is a grid. I don't draw noses or eyes or anything. So let me give you an example. Now, if I had painted this painting with a diagonal grid, the iconography would be the same. It would be Roy Lichtenstein. And reduced on the page, it would look like the same image of Roy Lichtenstein. But the choice to do it as a horizontal vertical grid, well, if I'd done it as a diagonal grid, his nose would have been a straight line, like a ski jump. And, you know, your eye would just like shoot right off the edge of the painting. So by deciding to do this as a horizontal vertical grid, it's like your eye is splashing down his nose like water on the rocks in a waterfall. The imagery is the same, but the experience is different. And that's really what interests me. It's not just what I'm doing, but the choices that make it a different experience for the viewer. Our painters are orchestrators of experience. That's what we're doing. There's a kind of ritual dance that takes place in the studio. We're performing artists, just nobody watches us perform. But we're dancing in front of the rectangle, and we're making these gestures. There are times when it's like conducting music or whatever. And then the painting is the frozen evidence that that ritual dance, that performance took place. And it goes out into the world, and it stands in for the artist and for that performance. But when a viewer gets involved with that, you can almost dance along with it. You can almost, you can understand the nature of that performance. And that's what I think, when I go to museums and I look at, or galleries, and I look at someone else's work, there's a vicarious experience when you realize that this was made. This is not a photograph that happens and comes all up in one moment. It's made by hand. Painting is the most transcendent of all the mediums, I think, because it denies its physical reality. It is colored dirt on a flat surface. It makes space where there is no space. It reminds you of life experiences you've had. It transports you somewhere else. A colored dirt on a flat surface, it can make you cry. I mean, it's kind of amazing. So we orchestrate, let's go to the next one, you'll see the nose a little better. But you see, what I'm trying to do is not just make Roy Lichtenstein's nose, but give you something of a more kind of lyric experience. At the same time, hopefully it's hard-nosed, no pun intended, and that it's tough and whatever kind of image that you want to make. But I really do believe that what we do is a kind of magic. If I talk about it, or I feel like I'm dropping crumbs along the trail, Hansel and Gretel style, people want to pick them up, they can take the journey that I've taken in making the work. I don't want to destroy the magic. I love pulling the rabbit out of the hat. But I'm perfectly happy to go back and show you how I pulled the rabbit out of the hat. And that's true if you look at Frans Hals, where you see strokes, 4 or 5 or 6 strokes, building a hand. The great Velázquez portrait of his black assistant. I mean, you're just watching. You have a record of the decisions and this incredible construction that in front of your very eyes, it's an apparition. It's like built out of thin air in front of your very eyes. And that physicality and the denial of the physicality and that ripping back and forth, I think, is really incredible high for me.
Well, I have 2 more questions, and then I'm going to open up to the house, and there will be mics on either aisle. So when we get to that point, I'll put the signal out, but please start thinking of questions that haven't been asked, or a different way, better way of asking some of the ones that have been asked, and we'll find out.
Or give me a better answer if you got one.
That's also true. One question is about context, and I'm going to step aside for a second also and do a little editorial. But many of the people, in fact, a large portion of the people that you've painted are members of the art community. As you were saying to the students when we were talking with them before, you painted Phil Glass before Phil Glass was Phil Glass, and Richard Serra before Richard Serra was a well-known artist. So some of these people are known now, but were not known then. Some of the ones you painted more recently are well-known figures, so I like Roy Lichtenstein, but that becomes a dialogue between generations. You as a younger artist speaking to an older artist who is significant. This represents a community of artists altogether, and this is where my little editorial will come. There is no one I know, I mean literally nobody, who has spent more time, precious time given how difficult life can be sometimes now for Chuck, on things having to do with the arts community. We have served on the Sharp Foundation together, the Tiffany Foundation, the Rome Academy, and there are countless others on which we have not served together, but Chuck has done, where in making sure that there were resources for artists, opportunities for artists, and so on, giving back to that community was a part of what he has done. There are a lot of artists out there who have had comparable careers, but I can't think of any of them who put back so much into that same community. And with that as background, since it partly recognizes that life for artists has gotten more complicated and in some ways more difficult rather than less, even amidst prosperity, I wondered if you'd talk a little bit about how you view the changes in the art world that you've inhabited now for 50 years, really.
Well, just to say one thing about my choice of, just to back up a little bit and say a little bit about my choice of subjects. I wanted to paint anonymous people because Andy Warhol was painting superstars, and so I tried to find, I would just use my friends, and they were all around, and they were truly anonymous. We were all really anonymous. So I painted them, and then they all managed to get famous on me and screw it up. So then I started painting my family, and I painted my family for a while. And just before I went in the hospital, I did a series of paintings of painters that we know what they look like because they do self-portraits. And so I did Alex Katz and Lucas Samaras and Francesco Clementi and Cindy Sherman. And I tried to, we know what they look like, but I wanted to see whether I could make an image of them that you knew because you knew them, but still looked like my work. And then I went in the hospital, and besides my real family and friends, my close personal friends, who showed up, the art world really showed up, and they were really pulling for me. And it was, it can be, there's some bitterness. I was successful. There's some competition, but really people really put that aside, and they were pulling for me. And I would see looming at the end of my bed in the dark, I'd see the disembodied faces of all these people who were part of the art world community. And I realized it was the other family. And that what families do is sustain you and prop you up and encourage you. And that's what the art world did. And that's when I embarked on doing portraits of artists of all generations who are important to me on one level or another. Not all of them are my best friends. Some were heroes of mine like Jasper Johns and Rauschenberg, Paul Cadmus, Roy Lichtenstein, who were of a generation older than me. And then I began to look at younger artists with whom I felt I had some sort of significant relationship through the work. And I used it as a way to get to know them. I asked if I could paint them. I didn't know them very well. We'd get involved. And then I began to have another kind of relationship with them. So I've really liked the idea of celebrating this connectedness and celebrating the community that is the art world. And you wear as many hats, art world hats, as anybody I know. You curator, art writer, now a dean, painter. You bridge all those gaps. But what we have is an incredible, support system that's also competitive. But often competitive in the very best sense of the word. But what we have now is such a different art world than when I came up. I was saying to the students earlier, when I first started going to New York to the galleries in 64, 65, and when I first moved to what became Soho in 67, there were 14 galleries that showed the work of living artists in New York City. And they went from 86th Street to 56th Street, or 55th Street, along Madison Avenue, and that was it. And if you saw the work of a living artist in New York, any given month, that was it. Those were the choices. And every artist saw every other artist's work. If you got a show, you knew that everybody of every stripe and every attitude would see it. Now there are, what, 400 or 500 galleries in Chelsea alone. And it's so hard to get anybody to see your work, so hard to get any attention. And it's unbelievably expensive. When I was living in New York, when I first came to New York in '67, a 2,500 square foot loft, you know, I paid $125, and everybody else was paying $50. They thought I was an idiot to spend that much money. Now that same space would be $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a month if you could find it. And so the pressures on artists today are much greater. The sacrifices are greater. It's had a tremendous effect on the art world. It's forced people to collapse their careers into a much shorter period of time to try. They've made this big investment. They're coming out of schools like perhaps this one with $50,000 or $60,000 of student loans that they have to pay off. You know, I think it's having a tremendous effect already on, and rampant careerism, how to make it happen fast, and really kind of desperation to get seen and to be recognized and to make it happen. And that's putting a lot of pressure on the art world.
Okay, my last question, and then we'll open it up. The genre that you picked was portraiture, and there was a time when you talked about heads rather than portraiture, because portraiture has meant many things. It's meant official pictures that would portray an important person with all the trappings of their importance. It's also meant, through much of the history of Western art, a kind of introspective or psychologizing representation. Mm-hmm. If Rembrandt looks in the mirror, he finds himself in the different ages of man, so to speak, and each portrait is full of affect and complication and so on that is directly emotional. The same thing probably of Van Gogh, and now if you think of Frida Kahlo, whose show just opened at the Walker, people gravitate to pictures of Frida Kahlo because of the psychological complexity and the symbolic complexity of those pictures. Your paintings, at least on the surface, don't have the symbolic element. They do not look back at you in quite the same way that self-portraits have done often, and that portraiture in general has done. And I wondered if you could talk about your relationship both to the expectation that the depiction of the body, of the head, of a part of the body, convey specific kinds of meanings, whether that's been a constraint, something to push against, and also finally whether or not after years of painting Phil and years of painting yourself, you've actually learned something in that domain.
I think it's too late for that. Well, you know, when I made the first big head, I wanted to rip it loose from the context in which we normally see it. There was a widely held convention, which is still taught in the New York Academy of Art, that you cannot make a head larger than life size. In fact, there are a lot of really weird paintings in which they have huge, from history, huge bodies with little bitty pinheads because they want to make a heroic painting, but they were absolutely convinced that we could not relate to an image larger than life size. Well, of course, cinema and billboards and everything else have come along and changed that. But what I wanted to do was to break the image away from the way by making it almost Brobdingnailian. I'd make a head so big that at the average viewing distance you couldn't see it as a whole, and force you to scan it and almost see the face as a landscape. If you think of Gulliver's Lilliputians crawling on the face of the giant, they know everything about that face, every beard hair, every whatever, and they'd trip and fall into a nostril or something. But they didn't know that they were on a head at all, and I wanted to try and make the face almost as a kind of landscape. And those are very simultaneously keep you at arm's length across the room, a big aggressive confrontational thing, middle distance where you sort of scan it, and then hopefully suck you right up to the surface. Well, the only time you ever see that, we look at the distance most of us stay from each other. We don't see that kind of detail. The only time you ever see that detail is if you're making love. It's a very intimate kind of off-putting thing sometimes. So,
with the lights on too.
yeah, right. But then and I was trying to get rid, as you mentioned, I tried to get rid of virtuoso brushmanship and kind of, marks for effect. But I realized that the face is a roadmap, as you mentioned, a roadmap of your life. If you've laughed your whole life, you have laugh lines. If you've frowned your whole life, you have furrows in your brow. And there's a way to read a painting if it's presented neutrally and straightforward, flat-footedly, as the same way we make assumptions about people we meet. If I have somebody laughing or I have someone crying, then there's only one reading. So, but I think in terms of the expressive content, one of the things that you wrote in my MoMA retrospective, which really sticks with me in this way, is I did it, and it's great to be talking about her here. My wife's grandmother, Fanny, a Holocaust survivor, her 10 brothers and sisters were killed, her mother and father, all her aunts and uncles, and through an absolute fluke, just something she had no control over and really didn't even like, she was the only survivor. And her face embodied, she was the most optimistic person that I've ever known. And her face embodied both tremendous loss and sorrow and this incredible optimism and positiveness, I thought. And you said in the catalog essay, because it's a fingerprint painting, actually there's an image of it in here somewhere, a black and white finger painting in which I paint by picking up ink and pressing it onto the canvas. You said it was skin making skin. I thought I was making something you couldn't forge, but yours was much more poetic. The skin making skin, as if I were caressing her face while I was building her image. And I thought, wow, it's exactly how I felt while I was making that painting. I was building an image carefully, meticulously out of little personal marks to remind me of this wonderful person who existed in my life. And I think, well, if that's not expression, I don't know what is. Even though it's not flamboyant, even though it's not gestural, and it also embodied many of the things I liked about process. Normally, you have to feel through a brush. You have to feel through a pencil. By using your body as a tool, there's nothing between you and the painting. Your body is the tool. People are somehow rather impressed that I was able to make, because kids make sloppy finger paintings, that I could make a finger painting that actually looked like something. So people are sort of impressed that I was able to do it. But in fact, using your body as a tool, you know exactly how much paint you've picked up, and you know exactly how hard you're pressing. And to not have to translate it through some tool, it puts you in obviously direct contact with the thing that you're making. So I guess my feeling about, now I've gotten to paintings which are more gestural, but they're dumb gestures. They're inarticulate gestures. They're not making something in a dramatic and dazzling way. It's simply a donut shape or a hot dog shape or whatever. And it's only clusters of these marks that make something expressive, not the mark itself. So I'm reining in and actually commenting on gestural painting by making the gesture serve a greater need of building an image. Incremental ways of working, like an architect choosing the brick, there's nothing about the brick that determines what kind of building it's going to be. You stack up the bricks one way, you make a gas station. You stack up the bricks another way, you make a cathedral. both of them, they're totally different experiences, but the brick didn't determine the experience. It's only how the brick is used.
Well, I'm going to turn it over there just to add one thing. When making the retrospective, I discovered exactly how much the kind of tenderness, you'd have to say, and again, affect of the Fanny painting conveys itself to the general public, because in requesting pictures for retrospective, you usually get resistance. It's usually resistance based on the proud possessors wanting to have this work to show off, or the genuine collector wanting to have it to look at, or the genuine collector, proud possessor, and insurance company being worried about what will happen to it when it's away. The Fanny pictures in the National Gallery in Washington, in that particular case, we got echoes from people who complained that their picture had been taken away from them in order to put in another museum. Yeah. Okay, so with that, I don't know exactly how effectively I will spot hands, so I'm going to trust that Lynn and others will be helping out in that department. But please feel free to ask questions, and just make sure that the questions are questions. Speeches are for some other time. We haven't much time. And by the way, if you have to go to dinner or class, don't worry. We're old pros. We'll still be here. Okay.
Just take the names of those people who are leaving.
Exactly. You'll never get a retrospective. Good.
Chuck, you call painters orchestrators.
I don't think your mic is on.
Hello?
Yeah.
There you go.
Chuck, you call painters orchestrators of experience. What do you call photographers?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that, because I love photography. It is really, I don't collect much, but just about all the thing I do collect are photographs. And I love making photographs, and I love looking at photographs. They're just very different. Photography is the easiest form, the easiest medium in which to be competent. Anybody can take a competent photograph. Give them a good point-and-shoot camera, and give them several hundred shots, and there's going to be an accidental masterpiece in there someplace. I used to watch on between 13th and 14th Street on Broadway for a while. They had a photo lab in which you could watch the photographs falling out, which is a real invasion of privacy in a way when you stop and think about it. But you watch there was an occasional piece of porno that would go by. You watch the photographs falling out, and about every 100 or 150 photographs, there's a damn good photograph. Believe me, there's never been a painting that's an accidental masterpiece by somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. You're going to make 100 bad paintings before you ever get started, as we were talking about today. Now, okay, given that makes photography sound easy, if it is the easiest form in which to be competent. But without touch, without hand, without signature style, without physicality, without actually pushing stuff around, it is the most difficult medium in which to establish a personal vision. And when a photographer has done that, when you know a Diane Arbus whenever you see it, when you know, pick your favorite photographer, when you recognize that photographer's work instantly from across a crowded gallery, you know that artist has really done something, because they've taken a medium that does not embody physicality, touch, hand, all those things which we associate with signature style, and they've still managed to make it their own. So I have tremendous respect for what photographers have been able to accomplish when they really do make something that is unique and personal.
Hi, Chuck. My name is Miles. I go to Mass Art, and you're welcome to come there anytime.
Where the hell are you?
I'm over here. Hi.
Where do you go?
I'm over here. Oh, down here.
Ooh, okay.
Hi. I just wanted to say that you're a hero of mine, and I wanted to know if you could expound on your learning disabilities, the jobs that you had to support your art before your art supported you, and your favorite brand of scotch.
Oh. Well, like I started to say, I can't remember whether we talked about this before or now. If I'm saying the same thing, let me know. Everything is driven by my learning disabilities, and you think also, besides face blindness and other problems that I had that drove me to paint portraits, I was overwhelmed by the whole. A lot of people who have learning disabilities have to break things down. They're overwhelmed by the sheer enormity of the problem. So you break it down into a lot of little bite-sized pieces. You say, I don't know how to make that nose, but I know how to make this little piece. And if I make enough pieces, eventually I have a nose. And this whole belief in process, that if you follow a process wherever it goes, that this will somehow, this will set you free. And, I've been in therapy for 35 years. You might not know it, but believe me, I've been there. I don't do art for therapy, I do therapy for therapy. But you think you're never going to, after 35 years, you're never going to learn anything new. But recently I had an epiphany, just like a breakthrough. When I was a kid, after my father died, I moved next door to my grandparents, and my mother went to work outside the home for the first time, and so I was with my grandparents a lot. And my grandmother was also a nervous wreck, and she had busy hands. And she would knit and crochet and make quilts and patchwork quilts and whatever. And I used to watch her, and I saw how soothing it was, that keeping her hands busy and doing this calmed her down. There's an aspect of what I do that's a little bit like raking gravel in a Zen Buddhist garden, today I'm going to do what I did yesterday, and tomorrow I'm going to do what I do today, and if I just keep doing it, I'll get somewhere. Just like, how do you make a sweater? Oh my God, if you knit one and purl two long enough, and you believe, you will get a sweater. So I'm thinking about my grandmother, and this is to show you how old I am. I used to go over to, she had a TV, to watch the McCarthy hearings on television, so it's a long time ago. But she was crocheting stars, and every star was different, without a pattern, and she had stacks of them on the floor. And once she had stacks of these stars that she crocheted, she would crochet those together and make these big banquet-sized tablecloths, crocheted tablecloths, which were then stretched in the backyard on big wooden stretchers, bleached and starched and put out in the sun. She was making a big, complicated image out of a lot of little handmade things. Building this thing that was, I'm sure, a really important experience for me to see not only that you make this big thing out of all these little things, but also that the activity itself brought her pleasure and made her relaxed and calm. So that attitude, I think, definitely comes from her. Also, I remember she was knitting a sweater while we were watching the McCarthy hearings. And it was a complicated thing with lots of cables, and she'd been working on it for weeks. And she starts pulling it, ripping it out, and rolling it back up into balls. And I said, Grandma, what are you doing? You're throwing away all that time and energy you put into it. And she said, if it's not making something you want to make, stop and start over. Do something else. Time is not important. Only what you make is important. And I think that that was a really important experience for me as well. I used to work every day, and I made a painting every day, but I didn't like what I made. Now I work every day, and I make a painting every 3 months, 5 months, 6 months, or a year. Work is work, and it only matters what you make. And the pleasure I get, I can say without fear of contradiction, there isn't an artist working in the world today that gets more pleasure day in and day out from what he or she does than I do. I just love it. I love it, the activity, I love what I do. But if it didn't make something that mattered to me, it would just be masturbatory. It would just be doing it for pleasure. I make art for other people. I would not be an artist, one of those artists on a desert island with no audience, so driven to make art that I would jab a stick into my hand and get blood and draw in the back of a leaf, you know? If there ain't somebody around to look at it, I'm not going to bother, you know? I believe in communication. I believe in putting stuff out. I believe in the receiver. I believe in, Duchamp said, artist has 50% of the responsibility, that's to get it out, but it isn't complete until it's returned by the viewer. So as much as I enjoy the activity, and I enjoy doing it every single day, I still am making it for you guys.
So what's the scotch?
And the scotch. Well, depends.
Okay, let's have a few more.
Gina Sandlin, and I was just wondering, your ability to reinvent and make new connections with forgotten or unconventional methods, such as your recent exploration of textiles, the use of the fingerprint, and your past reconsideration of paper making is without a doubt unparalleled. In regards to new media or methodology, where do you see your work going next?
I've learned never to make predictions, because as soon as I do, you know what you do in your mind's eye, you complete this piece, it all goes swimmingly. You say, I'm going to do that, and boy, if I do that, I'll do that. And then you try to do it, and it never works out. It never works like you think it's going to work. So I try not to plan ahead or to do too much. I find, for instance, that I stumble on things. And I stumble on things because I'm there every day, you know? You mentioned the paper pulp. Unique work becomes multiples, which become unique work, which become multiples, and they keep reinforming each other. I did a watercolor. The watercolor was in a grid. I decided to make pulp paper pieces by squirting wet pulp into the squares of a plastic waffle grill. So the unique work became a multiple based on 24 grays of pulp that are squirted in these spaces. So then that pulp falls on the floor, hardens into little discs that are the various 24 grays, formed by gravity. They're beautiful little things. I pick them up. Looking at them, what can I do with them? I'll make a collage. So that from the unique work to the multiple, now it's back to a unique work in the form of a collage. Now I want to make a multiple based on that collage. So I find a way to bend metal to make an eccentric shaped grill so I can make a multiple based on that. So each thing reinforms the next, each thing leads somewhere else, and once in a while you get to a dead end and you back up and you decide to go a different direction. But I've never had a day's painter's block. I'm sure some people think I should have taken other routes. I probably took the wrong off-ramp, you know, once in a while. But basically, everything sort of flows. And like I say, inspiration, did I say it already here, or did I say it before? Said it here both times?
No, not yet here.
Oh, not yet here. I was, inspiration is for amateurs. The rest of us show up and get to work. And that's if you wait for the clouds to part and a bolt of lightning to hit you in the head and a great art idea, you can wait the rest of your life. But if you just get busy, things will occur to you. Doors will open, sometimes only a crack, and then you just start to pry it open. And sometimes you have to bash right through the door, but it will occur to you in the process of doing what you're already doing. And that's really a great way to keep moving. It's not progress, it doesn't mean it's better, it's just movement. All you can program is movement and change.
Is there anybody in the back 40 there who wants to, there's a woman right by the door in the back.
There's 2 mics. I think.
Where is that scotch now we need it?
Back there, take it back there.
Hello. Hi, my name is Christina Goodwin, and thank you very much for coming. It's really amazing to see you guys here. I have a question basically for both of you. At the level that your careers are at, you're able to travel a lot, it sounds like, and I wanted to know, is there anything from other cultures that you've seen recently or in the last 10 years or so that you wish the art scene in America could learn from or take in, that, you've seen something, say, in the Middle East or in London, say, or anywhere that America could learn from in the art scene?
Well, you just curated a big international exhibition in Venice. Talk about it.
The answer is there's almost unimaginably many things that we should be looking at, should be thinking about, that the American art world has been enormously productive, enormously imaginative, enormously many things for 50 years. Not forgetting, of course, that prior to the Second World War, a lot of Europe looked at us as if we were completely provincial and small. But we have also had a tendency in the moments of this country's greatest activity, if you will, first to look at other parts of the country. If you think that the East Coast, Boston, New York, wherever, have had most of the attention, to look at other parts of this country as if they were somehow regional, provincial, whatever. It turns out, from my point of view, that Los Angeles, in terms of the production of new ideas and young artists, is at least the match for New York. But the truth of the matter is that there has been international modernism in Latin America, in Central Europe, not just Western Europe, in Japan, and so on, for decades. In fact, if you look at Latin America, the first modernisms in Brazil date to about the time that they started in this country, 1913, 14, 15. And that we are woefully unaware of those traditions, of how very different they are from ours, and also how very much entangled with them we are nevertheless. And I think the biggest gap in the art world is its ignorance of other art worlds, and that those art worlds are not new. If they occur to us for the first time, they don't occur to themselves for the first time, and that a lot of young art students would profit enormously by looking at other art histories. And by also, and I said this afternoon to the painters, by also considering the possibility that the best future for any given kind of art making that you may be doing may not be in Chelsea. It may be in Berlin, it may be in Sao Paulo, it may be in Osaka, Tokyo, it can be in all kinds of places in the world that are now being part of these big exhibitions, but what you see in them is a tip of the iceberg in terms of each particular location. That's not, of course, even to begin the whole question of cultural, ethnic, religious, and other kinds of difference, and that focuses on the fact that you don't just go out and find something else and then exoticize it, or something else and define it by how it's different from you. You have to get inside of it and think about how it is for the people and places where it is made.
You as a curator, not only would artists be well served by looking around to see what else is there, it'd be great if some curators did. When you were a curator at the Modern, you rummaged around in the basement, you found tremendous examples of Central and South American art that have been in the collection for decades, that had never seen the light of day. And in the Venice Biennale, you have work from Africa, you have work from, it takes some work to look outside of your own culture.
Yeah. It's also terrifically exciting because if you get depressed about this art world, and there's some reasons that one might, go to another art world which is not, glutted with money and publicity, and you can be entirely revived, if you will, by the idealism of people who make really good work with almost no reward for what they do, but with a sense that they are doing it, as Chuck says, for a community of interest. And that community of interest is not just another art world, it is, in many cases, a world, a culture.
This question is for both of you. Obviously, Mr. Close, your influence on the art world is clear. Can you suggest any specific new and up-and-coming artists who you think are people to watch moving forward?
I no longer handicap. There was a time when I could, but I'm afraid I don't see as much, and it's easy. It's just I go around as much as I used to. I go to as many galleries as I used to, but I'm covering about 1/100th of 1% with the same amount of energy that used to let me cover the whole shooting match. And I'm also old and out of touch, and But anyhow, I do think that there's a lot of interesting work being made. I still, there's probably the same percentage of crap to good stuff that there always was, but we're drowning in a sea of crap because just so much art. But there never was a particularly high percentage of quality. It was always iffy, don't you think?
Yeah. I think it was Stravinsky when he gave the Norton lectures at Harvard, talked about the issue of sincerity in art, and he said, there's a lot of sincere art, and there's insincere art, and there's sincerely insincere art, but most of all of it is crap. So sincerity or irony or whatever is not the litmus test of whether it's good. Within any of those categories, it can be good. But let me say a little bit in answer to your question. I've partly gotten out of a habit of naming names because if you are in a position where people listen to you, you have to think of the consequences. And I really am not interested in handicapping the market. When I make an exhibition, I'm recommending that people take seriously the following artists. But I sort of avoid situations where that might be taken as a recommendation that somebody who's fortunate enough to have the means goes out and buys it, right? But there are 101 artists or artist collectives in the Venice Biennale. About a third of them are pretty well known, although in truth, they're also only well known to their particular art worlds. Probably only 20% are really well known internationally. So that means 80% of them are in play, if you will, to some or another relatively sophisticated audience. But the other part of it is they're not all young. Now, I've been taken to task for the idea that my exhibition has a lot of old artists in it. I should say that it has very few artists that are as old as some of the ones that are in the Documenta. But anyway, it does have quite a lot of mid and late career artists. And it has a good deal to do with our cultural orientation. If you define the present is not made by people who are 20-something or 30-something. It's made by anybody who has a fresh idea, who's active in the current scene. If you were going to do a review of contemporary literature, you wouldn't just do first novelists, right? You'd throw in Philip Roth, and you'd throw in Doris Lessing, who just got the Nobel Prize. You'd throw in Roberto Bolaño, who died recently, but whose novels are just being published. It's a very wide cross-section. So, anecdote. We just gave the awards in Venice to the people who won prizes for Best Artist in Show and so on. The jury was all younger than I was. None of them were American. All of them were cutting-edge types and so on and so forth. And the predictions were that this jury would correct my interest in mid-career and older artists and get it back to where it should be, which is on what's, the happeningist generation, right? In fact, they gave the grand prize to an 87-year-old Argentinian artist who made some of the weirdest stuff you have ever seen. An enormous styrofoam blob covered with those little eyes that wobble with the pupils in them that you find on dolls. sitting on a chair in the middle of a room where there are some of the most tough political images that you will ever see about Abu Ghraib, about the dictatorship in Argentina, about the Vatican and its social policies relative to gays, relative to a lot of other things. And the translator of the award ceremony talked about younger artists and the avant-garde, about artists and the avant-garde, meaning not older artists. Avant-garde is young, other artists get their valedictory prize. And I had to correct her Italian and say, by the way, sometimes the oldest artists are the avant-garde. So here's another member of that club. Not 87. Yeah, one more question.
Thank you, gentlemen, for such a wonderful conversation. Bob and Chuck, the last time that I see you together was in New York in 1998, Maria Magdalena Campos Pons.
Yeah, sure.
I was the young Cuban girl in the little room at the time that the retrospective was taking place, and it was a great pleasure to meet you both there. And then I see you, Bob, in Cuba, in Havana, in which it was a very exciting scene. But my question is not about both of these locations. Primarily for you, Bob, about how do you see the role of education and art schools in the context of defining contemporary art? You left a very important post as a curator of painting and sculpture at MoMA to go to Connecticut. And that is something that, at least for me, has been an important question about, and it's a trend too. There are a few other important curators that are doing such significant move from curatorial post to education. So I wonder, what is in there in education defining the future of contemporary practice, or the future of art practice that have bring to your attention to do that move and to others? And I don't know if the question is clear, but I have this in mind, that what is in education that really bringing such people as you. I could mention in San Francisco, Oku and Weso, for instance, Documenta, just doing this incredible shift of location from MoMA to Yale, from Documenta to San Francisco, etc.
Okay, well, there are a lot of, that's a complex question, and the reality to which it refers is so complex I can't quite get all of it around, and some of it, in fact, is still top secret. But the basic thing is that I have always done several things. When I was at the Modern, I taught at the Keeney Graduate Center. Greg Williams was in the seminars when I was there. I've always done several things at once and tried to vary the proportions so that I could stay fresh. At a certain point, it seemed to me that working in the context of the Modern did not hold out a future of being able to do as many things as I would like to do, and therefore I moved into situations where I thought that that would be the case. Frankly, also, you can get locked into your own identity, and you got to know when that's happening. Just as Chuck changes materials and changes the ways of working, people who are in doing some of the things I do have to change the means. And being famous for something in a situation without freedom is a trap, and it's ultimately a lethal trap for the person who's in it. So you change gears. And I find being around younger artists, artists in formation, and of course the faculty, who are younger than I am, most of them, is rejuvenating. And I'm actually having a very good time figuring out where I am in a world which is not about my power, but is about the information that can be shared. And if indeed the American art world is in a sense suffering from its prosperity, we get a chance to mix it up a little bit.
Thank you very much. I know that there's probably many, many more questions, but unfortunately we don't have time to take any more. So thank you very much for coming, and give a big hand.